Welcome everyone to our February guest lecture on the legacy of darkness and light, our cultural icons and their God complex. A warm welcome back to our guest speaker today, Michael Gellert, a Jungian analyst practicing in Los Angeles. Michael will be presenting material from his recent book by the same name, interspersed with questions and discussions. And by the way, your Zoom registration link includes a link to purchase his signed book from the C.G. Jung Institute bookstore for a 25% discount. Michael will be discussing the Yahweh complex, which resembles the stormy God of the Hebrew Bible. This is a God image that carries over as God the Father in the New Testament and Allah of the Qur'an. This complex can be either light or dark, influencing our social environment, culture, public affairs, international relations, and our treatment of the earth. Michael will look at some famous figures in history like Machiavelli, Abe Lincoln, Martha Stewart, Vladimir Putin, Mel Gibson, and Bob Dylan, who exemplify some of these archetypal qualities. He will help us identify our own Yahweh complex so that we can deal with it in a healthy, conscious way. Michael Gellert was former director of training at the C.G. Jung Institute and in Los Angeles, and a humanities professor at Varnier College in Montreal. He has been a mental health consultant for University of Southern California and Time Magazine. He's lived in Japan, where he's trained as a Zen master. He is the author of award-winning books, which include The Way of the Small, Divine Mind, America's Identity Crisis, and Far from This Land. So we welcome back our guest speaker today, Michael Gellert.
Thank you. Those are very nice words. I appreciate them. I should make a small correction. I trained in Japan with a Zen master. I wish I trained as a Zen master, but with was pretty good. Thank you for having me come back. I enjoy, every time I come, I enjoy the audience. I enjoy the attentive listening and the good cheer, not to mention also your questions, your perceptions on what I talked about. I'd like to start by simply saying that what we're going to do today, I'm going to read to you 3 sections from the 5 sections that comprise the prologue of the book. That will give you an emotional gut feeling, hopefully, of how this complex manifests and the damage it can do. There is such a thing as the positive Yahweh complex, which is also a historical force, and it says a lot about the positive side of the biblical God. The 2 sides together really are projections or expressions of our own 2 sides, our darkness and our light. Again, you'll see how that manifests after the prologue. I will share 1 or 2 chapters with you. They're relatively short. And that'll give you an idea both of the subliminal nature of this complex, as well as how complicated it could be. The complex, it's complex. Jung called his early psychology, he called it complex psychology, meaning it's the psychology of our inner other people within us. Could be the gods and the goddesses too. Later, he changed the name when he was informed that in English, it particularly sounds like his psychology is very complicated because it's complex psychology. Actually, a lot of what Jung talks about, of course, is complicated, but a lot of it is also pretty straightforward. So on that note, what I will do now is I will read you the first 3 sections of the prologue. And you'll know when I come to the end of that. We'll take a quick moment break and catch our breath. And then I will read to you the last, the two chapters. And you'll see also how they fit into the book as a whole. And then we're going to have, I believe, a bit of a 10-minute break. And then we'll have the full second hour for questions and answers. And also, I'd like to invite you all to feel free to share during the question and answer period any Yahweh experiences that you've had, either within yourself or with loved ones or with friends and family, with employers, comes up in any kind of situation. And if you feel like sharing, we will all be very supportive and understand that you're talking about a part of you, not all of you, because the Yahweh complex, when it gets all of us, well, I'll say it up front, we could see with the former president, a very strong example of the Yahweh complex, and he's in it all the time. Most people have a brush with it every now and again. It can dominate certain experiences, but if the person was exposed very young to a Yahvistic parent, for example, they can grow up internalizing that complex of the parent, and it finally becomes their own Yahweh complex. So on that note, it's a perfect entree to the prologue. The prologue is called The God of Our Fathers. My father, Leslie, had a special wisdom. He had an ability to see into the heart of many things, often dealing with them based on what he felt in his own heart. On one occasion, when I was 4 years old, I was feeling especially adventuresome. It was a Sunday morning, and on Sunday mornings, Leslie always took a long, hot bath while reading the newspaper with a small support cushion under his neck. I needed to urinate, and as customary, I could do so while he took his bath. The toilet was right next to the bathtub, and as I stood facing it, a tantalizing thought entered my mind. I said, "Dad, what would you do if I peed on you?" Remaining absorbed in his paper and not even looking at me, he said, "I don't believe you would do such a thing." Pondering his disbelief, I said, "Do you dare me?" Still fixated on his paper, he lackadaisically said, "You wouldn't dare." Again with that, I turned my little fountain of youth upon him, laughing and gleefully spraying his newspaper and his hands with the precision of a fireman putting out a fire. How bold one gets when one is sure of being loved, a young Freud wrote his fiancée. The paper went down suddenly into the water, and my daredevil attitude sprayed his hairy chest. He bolted up and screamed at me in Hungarian, "I don't believe it. Are you crazy?" An anger like I had never seen shot out from his eyes, and I realized I had done something terribly wrong. Frightened, I ran out of the bathroom and hid in my room for the rest of the morning. I do not remember the later events of that day, but I know that there were no consequences. Leslie never pursued the matter, and it was never mentioned or discussed. Some 40 years later, I was visiting my parents at their condo in Florida. Leslie and I were on lounge chairs, relaxing by the pool and enjoying the sun. I was reading a book, and he was, as usual, reading his paper. For some reason, my mind fell upon the old memory, now crusty from never having been spoken about and put to words. "Dad," I said, "do you remember when I was a little kid and peed on you in the bathtub?" He looked at me and said, Of course I remember. How come you never did anything about it? I asked. Without missing a beat, he said, because I realized that the only punishment fitting for such a crime was to kill you. And because you were my only beloved son, I knew I couldn't do that, so I let the matter drop. I can still hear the soft, deep timbre of his voice. Section 2 in the prologue. The other side of something that glitters. That's the title. Leslie did not always exercise such control over his rage. I will never forget my first encounter with it in an unrestrained form. It was not too long after the event I just described previously. He came home one late afternoon in a huff, telling my mother that he had to miss going to synagogue. I can't remember anything else he said. It wasn't, I knew, a Friday evening welcome to Sabbath service, because I went to synagogue with him every Friday evening, waiting with all the other kids for that special moment to run up to the cantor after his blessing of the wine and get a little cup of it, a sweet wine for the occasion. Somehow I knew I wasn't supposed to go on this particular visit to synagogue. Later, I was able to piece together that he probably missed attending his Yizkor service, at which he could recite the mourner's Kaddish, the memorial prayer on the anniversary of his father's death. He would do so in front of the unveiled scrolls of the Hebrew Bible, or as it is commonly known, the Old Testament. Leslie put his skull cap on his head and with prayer book in hand came into the living room where I was. He was going to conduct his own private prayer service, which, of course, I did not at the time understand. Now, this happened to coincide with the hour of one of my favorite events of the day. It had arrived. It was time for the Howdy Doody show. I turned on the TV in great anticipation. I lost my place. Leslie brusquely told me to turn it off. But it's the Howdy Doody show, I protested. Turn it off, he said in a raised voice. No, I want to watch Howdy Doody. All of a sudden, Leslie lunged toward me and started beating me. My mind was spinning. The blows to my body and my head came in rapid succession. My mother started screaming at him to stop. He was kicking me. She got in between his flailing arms and my little body, trying to protect me. I could sense her fear, probably as much for her own safety as for mine, and possibly for the safety of my brother, whom she may have been pregnant with at the time. The theme song from the show filled the air. It's howdy doody time, it's howdy doody time. I tried to get away from him, but I caught a blow that sent me headlong into the television set. The set was a TV set typical of the 1950s, made with a wood box that had pointy corners. My temple went into one of the corners. I vaguely recalled the sensation of falling as I collided with the TV. I can remember nothing else, as if my mind buried the rest of the trauma to protect me. I imagine there must have been blood. I was not taken to the hospital, though I should have been. I should have been given stitches. An indented scar sat like a small crater in my temple for the next 30 years, until it finally faded in with the rest of my skin. But my memory of the event never faded. I knew even then that I'd always remember it. In my adolescence, as I learned of Leslie's history as a prisoner who had been tortured by the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nazis, I came to understand his rage. Or at least I came to understand it better. After all, there were many Holocaust survivors who managed to get through life without such explosions of violence. Only much later would I understand that something else was at work here that melded in with his war trauma. Section 3 of the prologue. The stormy God within us. What this book is about. Who was this man who could be not only a loving father, but also a monster who in his devotion to God almost became the devil? And moreover, who was this God who could permit this to happen and perhaps even condone it? Was it he who cast a spell on Leslie? Quote, his sneezings flash lightning, and his eyes are like the glimmerings of dawn. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Fiery sparks escape. Out of his nostrils comes smoke, as from a steaming, boiling cauldron. His breath ignites coals. Flames blaze from his mouth. Strength resides in his neck. Power leaps before him. The layers of his flesh stick together. He is as though cast hard. He does not totter. His heart is cast hard as a stone, hard as the nether millstone. Divine beings are in dread, and he rears up. As he rears up, as he crashes down, they cringe. Thus did God speak to Job when he praised his most awesome creature, Leviathan, the monster of the sea. But it was not only God's beasts, Leviathan and Behemoth, who were monstrous. The dark side of God himself is revealed in stark terms throughout the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible itself shows this side again and again. It is the one scripture that is mutually venerated by the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He often behaved in primitive ways, erupting in temper tantrums and meting out his wrath without moral consideration. His propensity toward evil on the largest scale was demonstrated by his apocalyptic flood. A final apocalypse, thereafter becoming a general feature of the Abrahamic belief system and a particular one intrinsic to the Yahweh complex. In addition to the near total genocide of the deluge, the flood, Yahweh commanded the Israelites to commit numerous wholesale genocides in order to secure the promised land and to eliminate the threat of his chosen people. He was tempted by others who worshipped the rival gods of whom he was jealous. He was an explosive, brutal, and psychologically young God, and not the loving, equanimous, perfect being that many today look to in their faith. As Freud caustically put it, he was certainly a volcano god, quote, an uncanny, bloodthirsty demon who walks by night and shuns the light of day, end quote. Yahweh's monsters, after all, were but symbolic, poetic ways to speak about his wild and dangerous nature. This book is about the Abrahamic God's dark side and its impact on us. I wish to illustrate that the small but potentially deadly episode with my father was an expression of something that has been going on in different forms for a very long time. Many of our fathers have been instruments of God's dark side. That is because, psychologically speaking, they have lived under the same roof of the same God. This God is himself a father to both them and their fathers, going all the way back to Abraham, the founding patriarch to whom the Abrahamic religions owe their origins, if not further. He is the Father, the one whom we address when we say, "Our Father who art in heaven." He is known as Yahweh, sometimes mispronounced as Jehovah in the Hebrew Bible, the Father in the New Testament, and Allah in the Qur'an. What Leslie did to me was something that happened to him, that seized him. This is not to wash away his personal and moral responsibility for his action. Rather, this is to connect his action to a larger force that has come down to us through history. Rage, like the kind he unfurled, is built into the temperaments of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, just like it is built into the temperament of their mutually shared God. And these human and divine temperaments are related. It is true that peoples who have no connection to the Abrahamic religions are fully capable of rage too. And often this is indistinguishable from Yahvistic rage. It is also true that in the pantheons of other peoples, there are gods who, like Yahweh, blessed their wars and conquests. But there are significant differences that make Yahweh unique. For one thing, he's not worshipped as one among other gods, balanced by them in their various roles. He is worshipped as the one and only God who combines all roles. This endows him with an absolute authority and vitality heretofore unimagined. Though biblical scholars can trace the distinct ancient Near Eastern gods who were merged together in the Israelite tradition to create Yahweh, this historicism does little to detract from the power that this new mega personality held and still holds over the many heirs of the Abrahamic heritage. The new whole was greater than the sum of its old parts. On the ancient Near Eastern scene, Yahweh was a super god who acted in ways and with purposes not yet witnessed. His unpredictable, stormy temperament consisted of more than merely the furies of nature or human nature projected onto him. His rage went well beyond the pale of other gods, too. His actions represented more than simply the Israelite version of the vengeful acts Greek gods inflicted against humans for their insults to them. His wrath was filled with torment and deep resentment rooted in his being rejected by his creatures. And it struck with a personal sting, yet with blind indifference. To this day, it is central to the divine mystery itself and is the raison d'etre for the core religious attitude of all the Abrahamic traditions. In the psalmist's words, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Of course, I would not say that the force that seized Leslie was literally the ancient Yahweh. Instead, he was gripped by the Yahweh complex. That is, a God complex that takes on the specific features of Yahweh. The idea of a God complex is not new in psychology. Someone with a God complex tends to be inflated, arrogantly believing that their abilities, knowledge, and opinions are infallible, even when the facts prove otherwise. Sometimes they believe they are specially privileged and permitted to do things others are not. This gives their self-delusion a narcissistic and sociopathic quality. But with its distinct features, the Yahweh complex is a unique kind of God complex. It is modeled on the personality of Yahweh, a God whose role as creator quickly became overshadowed by that of a judge and warrior. In his judgments, he was frequently rigid and harsh, and in his punishments, petty and draconian. He was merciless with petty thieves, revealing how petty he himself could be. As a warrior, he was ruthless and savage. The Lord is a man of war, the Hebrew Bible tells us. He was also emotionally needy and wounded, for which he compensated by demonstrating his power, as often against his chosen people as on their behalf. He was, again, not the exalted, omniscient, and perfect being many people today imagine God to be. Flawed in all too human ways, he was, as literary critic Northrop Frye observed, quote, not a theological God at all, but an intensely human character as violent and unpredictable as King Lear, end quote. Hence, the Yahweh complex doesn't always look like a God complex, and to the uninformed person's eye, it may appear merely as nasty human behavior. Or, among its more nuanced features that set it apart from other God complexes, it can make us gloomy and withdrawn, like Yahweh himself often was. Either way, it doesn't necessarily exude the inflation and pseudo-confidence that a typical God complex would. Like an inferiority, persecution, martyr, Napoleon, or other complex, the Yahweh complex has a life of its own, exerting its influence on us, whether we like it or not, and whether we are aware of it or not. The Yahweh complex does not make us think we are God, Yahweh, the way, for example, a person with a messianic complex thinks that he or she has a special calling to help or save others at all costs. Rather, it makes us have the attitudes, emotional style, and behaviors of Yahweh, regardless of whether we recognize these as such. The Yahweh complex is Yahweh's personality within our own. It is, so to speak, Yahweh in us, an inner other, a godlike force within our own psyches. So in the form of our Yahweh complex, the ancient primitive God of the Hebrew Bible is alive and well in the world today. Unlike most other complexes, the Yahweh complex can operate collectively as well as individually, affecting sizable groups of people at the same time under the right circumstances. Jung might say that it is a collective and archetypal war god complex, similar to the Wotan complex that took hold of Nazi Germany and that was modeled upon the Teutonic or early Germanic tribal war god Wotan, known in Scandinavia as Odin. Like the Wotan complex, the Yahweh complex has many functions in addition to war. Having traveled down to us through history via the collective psyche, it includes ingredients of both collective consciousness, that which we are all aware of, and the collective unconscious, that which we aren't. Though knowledge about Yahweh is accessible to us through our collective consciousness, through our scriptures and religious institutions, knowledge of our Yahweh complex largely escapes us as it inhabits the collective unconscious, a mysterious domain whose depth is difficult to fathom. It is important that we begin to understand how this complex, so prevalent and yet so overlooked, can influence us. Whether or not we still worship and think of God strictly according to our Abrahamic traditions, or for that matter, even believe in him, the Yahweh complex can drive us to unconsciously act out the primitive attitudes, emotions, and behaviors that he typically demonstrates in the Hebrew Bible. If we fall into the grip of this complex, it can make us behave in the angry, controlling, power-driven way Yahweh often behaved. We will imitate his perfectionistic expectations, patriarchal authoritarianism, amorality, judgmental harshness, punitiveness, and drive to dominate others. In shaping our relationship to our own humanity as well as to others, the Yahweh complex can have detrimental effects on our culture, our organizations, and when it possesses our leaders, as it often does, our public and international affairs. The Yahweh complex may well be the most influential complex of all. So that covers the part of the introduction. Judy, could you please put up the PowerPoint with the book's chapter titles and subheadings?
That the first PowerPoint?
I can't remember which one is first. Just put it up and we'll move through it if we have to. Okay, that's it. So this is the table of contents of the book. In the entire book, I only mention the dream of one patient. I wanted particularly to have as examples for the Yahweh complex people whom we all know, who are well recognized in our cultural milieu, just to illustrate how widespread and subtle this complex can be. So I just read you from the prologue. Under that, you see chapter 1. Actually, you see part 1, I'm sorry, Yahweh in our souls. That's the individual place we encounter him. And the titles for the chapters are, one is how to recognize the Yahweh complex. It's really a treatment of the features of Yahweh in history upon which our own inner Yahweh complex is modeled upon. And then I start choosing from different people who have demonstrated a Yahweh complex. In the first chapter, I do talk about what we're going through in America today with Trump, because it's so well recognized. But I, to be honest with you, didn't feel like giving him a title for a chapter all of his own. So he's blended in with some other people who really illustrate the wide range of ways the Yahweh complex can manifest. It really sets the tone for the following chapters. So the second chapter is about the young Bill Gates. The third is Elliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York, his fall. That's not Como, it's not Governor Como. This Spitzner was, I think, in the 90s. Then the fourth is an intellectual look at how an intellectual might experience Yahweh and demonstrate him in his social interactions. That's a chapter on the philosopher Schopenhauer. Part 2 is Yahweh in our relationships. So now we're moving from the inner to the interpersonal. And these are the chapters for that. Fifth chapter on Freud, then one on not so much Marilyn Monroe alone, but the marriage of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio. You'll see about that a little more in a few minutes. The seventh chapter is the breakup of the Beatles, then the Rolling Stones' relationship to Yahweh. And then we come to part 3, the bully and the prince. The bully refers to the bullying that most of these young kids who come to school with loaded guns and kill people, it is their history for most of these kids, many if not most, but I would say that if you follow them closely on the news, it'll eventually come out that those kids who commit these horrors were bullied themselves as children. And what the gun slinging is about is paying the world back for how they experienced the world when they were younger, or even up to the time they go on their shooting spree. The prince refers to Machiavelli. Machiavellian logic, which is at the heart of almost all politics and the politics of all nations. There's a huge parallel between Machiavelli's prince and Yahweh. The 10th chapter has to do with religion. Now, this chapter is Yahweh in our midst. It's the cultural and social aspects of the Yahweh complex. So legalists, fundamentalists, and moral perfectionists are people who take religion and religious scripture literally. They're fundamentalistic. They exclude large portions of scripture to focus on the ones that they think are the ultimate truth. And moral perfectionists. There's a tendency toward striving for perfection, as if perfection were humanly attainable. If we go by the Hebrew Bible, even God was not perfect. And we could see that in his behaviors. But the Yahweh complex, in a way, picks up from where the Hebrew Bible left off. And the moral perfectionism of, for example, evangelists, they strive for perfection. And of course, when they can't attain it, and they get caught doing something like going to a prostitute, which I believe more than one of the American evangelists was caught on film with that. The world is surprised, but the two go together. Perfectionism is part of the Yahweh complex. So striving toward God with the aim to become perfect creates a dark scenario of its own. Chapter 11 is the sacrilege of holy war, as if there is such a thing as holy war. That's very Yahvistic. Holy war is primarily a Western and Islamic concept. In Eastern religion, you don't find much evidence for a holy war. There's plenty of war, but it's not blended in with religion and with a dark God figure or God image like Yahweh. And then the final chapter of part 3 is the embers of Western and Islamic imperialism. A long history of Yahvism that rarely was connected to God in any way other than by referring to him in the New Testament, the Hebrew Testament, and the Qur'an. You could see the seeds of imperialism in all three sacred scriptures. Judy, can you go to the next slide? So the book is mostly about the dark side of God, but it wouldn't be a fair treatment of Western religion or of God if we ignored his positive side. I talk about that also in the prologue, but here I use three examples of people who had a positive Yahweh complex, the light and bright side of God. Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, and Bob Dylan, all three of whom most of us are familiar with to varying degrees. And then the final chapter is how to live with our Yahweh complex, because there's no getting rid of it. It is too deeply entrenched in the collective unconscious that each of us carry to be pulled out, like when the dentist pulls out your tooth, it heals and you're over it. This doesn't work that way. It becomes part of the Western and Muslim structure of the psyche. The book concludes with a look at globalization in the Yahweh complex, because now that English has become the language of the business of the world, there are elements even of Western religion that have seeped their way into Eastern countries, Asian countries. So the epilogue talks a bit about that. Then there's an appendix on the main features of the Yahweh complex, a quick compendium. And this comes up with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan. I have an appendix that's a partial list of apocalyptic songs in rock and roll. And why rock and roll? You do get apocalyptic music in classical music, but it's nothing compared to the encyclopedic range for decades of apocalyptic themes in rock and roll. And that's really about it. So you can leave that up, or you know what, Judy, can you go to the next slide? People can look at that if they wish while I'm going to read the next chapter or two. So maybe in 5 minutes or so, Judy, you could go down to the next slide after people have had a chance to look at this. So contrary to the order of the chapters, I'm going to reverse two chapters and present them a slightly different way. This is chapter 7, the breakup of the Beatles. Now, I'm sure that all of you have your own associations to the Beatles, whether you were born in that era or before that era, or rather since that era. You've probably seen one or another of the documentaries that were approved by the Beatles or by the surviving Beatles. And even as recently as last year, we had a wonderful, lengthy documentary on the Beatles. This chapter draws on the same source as that, and you'll hear a little part of what's in that documentary. The documentaries sometimes diverge, but they don't really contradict each other. That last documentary by Peter Brooks, the Australian director, focused almost exclusively on the positive side of the Yahweh complex in the Beatles. But I have kept it, as with most of the chapters, to the dark side, because it's the dark side that we don't see, that we don't want to see, and that we so easily bury and forget about. So all the documentaries are all valuable for what each of them brings. So I'm going to read you the opening epigraph to the chapter. It's from the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, the very first book. And it's about an episode many of you will be familiar with. If not, it's okay. What I will read you is enough for what you need to know in order to appreciate the way the negative Yahweh complex came out among the Beatles. This is from the Bible. Quote, now Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower that man had built. This is the Tower of Babel. So they are all a single people with a single language, Yahweh said. This is only the beginning of what these humans will do. There will be nothing too hard for them to do. Come, let us go down, he's speaking to the angels, and confound their language so that they can no longer understand one another's speech. Yahweh scattered them then from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel or Babel, meaning in Hebrew to confound. And that's from Genesis chapter 11, for those of you interested. So here's the chapter. Was the dissolution of the Beatles the result of a divisive Yahweh complex that settled upon the group, imbuing them with a mistrust and souring their relationships to each other? So you see, we're seeing now a good example with these four men, these four great artists, of the interpersonal nature of the Yahweh complex. When I mentioned Schopenhauer and Bill Gates and the others, it's a one-to-one experience between the person and the complex. But with the Beatles, even four people have a small collective unconscious. Even four people can constellate the collective unconscious. And that's what we will see here. In the film Let It Be, one could sense the Yahvistic friction and melancholic heaviness in the studio. Friction and melancholy being typical features of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible that the other chapters illuminate. Paul would later describe this film, Let It Be, as a documentary that shows how a band breaks up. And George would refer to this period as the Beatles' winter of discontent. Like with the Hebrew Bible's end-stage books of Lamentation and Ecclesiastes, something was gone, leaving a flatness or deadness in its place. You could watch the longer or any of those documentaries and see how in the recording starting with the White Album, right through to the end with Abbey Road, a certain deadness in the studio. And you'll hear a little bit about what George did to change the emotional tone of that. The Beatles producer, George Martin, explained that the disillusionment and bickering that had begun in the recording sessions of the White Album had by the time of the Let It Be album intensified, this in spite of the many loving feelings and humorous, joyful moments the Beatles still share together, as revealed in Peter Jackson's documentary, The Beatles Get Back. In order to organize things, Paul became bossy, which the other Beatles resented. John would waft off with Yoko. This is George Martin, the producer, describing his observations. George didn't attend some sessions at all, even quitting the band for a few days. On the surface, exchanges like the following resemble the squabbles of any family. Paul, quote, he's talking to George, and it's in the documentary, and they're in the studio recording a song. And Paul says to George, "You always get annoyed when I say that." Some critique on his guitar playing. "I'm trying to help you, but I always hear myself annoying you. I'm not trying to get you." George, "Okay, I don't mind. I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." End of quote. Yet it is precisely in their resemblance to typical family squabbles that such exchanges display a Yahvistic dynamic. Got lost again. A power conflict infuses the communication with elements of control and resentment, and a mutual feeling of not being heard and respected prevails. It was to this that George was speaking when he later said that the Beatles' relationships with each other became very unhealthy and unhappy. John confirmed this, quote, "The whole pressure of making the film finally got to us, like people do when they're together. They start picking on each other. It's because of you. You got the tambourine wrong that my whole life is a misery. It became petty," John continues, "but the manifestations were on each other because we were the only ones we had." Because it was a family. Bossiness, pickiness, pettiness, blaming others, a miserable disposition, are these not among the traits of Yahweh? Partisanship, cliques, emotional splitting, projection, and paranoia, all Yahvistic traits, permeated like the collective psyche of the group as well. I know that a lot of this may sound to you raises a question mark, but please remember that I'm jumping to chapters that are in the middle of the book or toward the end of the book. And the qualities that I have here on these charts become much more clear because they're discussed in greater detail in the book. So I just wanted to point that out in case a lot of this stuff sounds relatively new to your ears. It is the case with most people in the West. We haven't read our own Bible, and we don't know what goes on in it in the great detail that it goes into. So Ringo talked about how the entire band became enveloped by the Yahweh complex. He doesn't use that language, but he illustrates it in what psychoanalysts, among others, understand as an intersubjective field. When the Yahweh complex constellates, it's not only within us, not only among us, with others in our community or society, it's also between us. And it's a very common observation in therapy that the therapist catches the mood or the feeling state of the patient as if it were traveling from the unconscious of the patient directly into the unconscious of the patient. So it could easily also happen in a group of 4 or in a large society. This is a merging or connecting together of a number of individuals' psyches, usually on an unconscious level and often in a manner that confuses the inside with the outside. You don't right away recognize that so-and-so is projecting their negative complex into you, into us, and we think it's ours because it's similar. It can have anger, it could have sorrow, it could have a desire for revenge, but often, just like in a crowd, like in a soccer stadium, the Yahweh complex kind of emerges there, and what was an enjoyable event turns into a murderous rage where people die with all the people in the stadium running for safety or and fighting with each other. Jung frequently referred to philosopher and anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl's related concept of this, pronounced in French as participation mystique. There's a mystical participation with each other through a complex. Note how the biblical archetype of judgment, even of oneself, is flying around like a bird in the sky, but within each of the members. Now, I'm going to read you what Ringo said that will illustrate how that complex is flying around like a bird. Ringo, quote, I quit the band in '67 on the White Album because I was in some emotional state where I honestly felt that I wasn't playing well. For some reason, I felt I just wasn't playing good, and those three were really close with each other. And I thought, well, I've got to deal with this anyways. So I went over to John's place. He was staying with Yoko in my apartment. And I said, look, man, I've got to say, I feel I'm not playing really good. And you three guys really are very close. And he goes, Paul goes, I thought it was you three. And I went to Paul's, Ringo again, and knocked on his door. And I said the same thing. I said, and you three are really close. And Paul said, I thought it was you three. And I'm going on holiday. I'm off. And I went to Sardinia. When I got back, they said, come on back, Ringo, we love you. George had decorated the whole studio with flowers, and that was a beautiful moment for me. So you could see the tension that builds up with a complex and releases itself naturally, invisibly, and we think it's about us, but it's about an archetypal complex. This whole idea of the three of them feeling they're not playing well, that's significant in light of the temperament of the biblical God. To play well means to truly play. However, unlike the flute-playing Krishna or the rotund laughing Buddha, Yahweh was not a playful God. So now I'm going to read to you the next section of the chapter on the Beatles, and that section is called Family Dynamics and the Assuaging Alchemical Agent of Water. The assuaging alchemical agent of water. The likelihood that all four musicians had been gripped by a dark complex is further supported by the fact that on both the White Album and Let It Be, the introduction of an outside musician changed the dynamic and broke the spell, at least temporarily. In a sense, the outsider played the role of a family therapist. His mere presence had a calming and sobering effect. George explains, it's interesting, quote, it's interesting to see how people behave nicely when you bring a guest in, because they don't really want everybody to know that they're so bitchy. And this happened back in the White Album when I brought Eric Clapton in to play on my song, My Guitar Gently Weeps. Suddenly, everybody's on their best behavior. So, while recording Let It Be, I put a message out to find Billy Preston, who was in town, and told him to come to the studio on Savile Road, which he did. Straight away, it just became 100% improvement in the vibe in the room, and everybody was happy, and also to have somebody else playing in the band. George Martin adds, the end of George's quote, George Martin, the producer, adds, Billy Preston was a great help. Listen to George Martin's language. He was an amiable fellow too, very nice. He was a kind of emollient, if you like, a kind of dissolver of glue, if you like. He helped, and this is George Martin, he helped to lubricate the friction that had been there. Well, this is exactly alchemy. Even the language is very alchemical. Martin's choice of the words emollient and lubricate is very telling. When the ego gets gripped by a complex and stuck in some situation or some viewpoint, it becomes rigid and fixated upon the emotions evoked. In connection to this, Jung noted that one's readiness for inner transformation is often announced by dreams of water. For these indicate that the ego is becoming more fluid, more open to change. The alchemists who projected psychological processes into concrete matter practiced this distillation of dense psychic states in a procedure they aptly called solutio, solution, solving, dissolving. We may say that the outside musicians helped dissolve tensions by altering the bad chemistry, not only between the Beatles, but also between the Beatles and the Yahweh complex that had hijacked their creative process. Of course, much more would have been needed to make this more than a temporary change. Complexes have their own fluidity, returning again and again like a tide coming in, waterlogging us and sweeping us away in their current, unless we learn how to swim against it. And surely the Beatles-Yahweh complex did return not long after they broke up. Yahweh's disgust with his people in the Hebrew Bible's prophetic period could easily be detected as the archetypal backdrop of John's diatribe against Paul in his haunting song, How Do You Sleep?, on his second solo album, Imagine. John wrote this attack on Paul's character in retaliation to what Paul later admitted was his little dig at John and Yoko in his song Too Many People on his second solo album, Ram, as if it were necessary to also attack the other spouse. However, what was said between one Beatle and another is less important than what it meant. In publicly airing their grievances in this way, most of us could remember that period, they weaponized their art, turning it into warfare aimed at hurting and damaging each other. When the Yahweh complex gets hold of us with its anger and hostility, considerations such as modesty and self-restraint go out the window. In George's song, Sue Me, Sue You Blues, on his third solo album, Living in the Material World, we can hear his despair as he sings of the ex-Beatles' bitter legal battles with each other. This was less a complaint than a dirge. With their lawsuits, the creative and collaborative spirit that the Beatles once shared had deteriorated into passive-aggressive, Yahvistic legalism. There you see the legality issue again. An approach to things we shall discuss in greater depth later. And as one of their final songs almost prophetically anticipated, boy, they carried that weight for a long time. But at least for a short while between Let It Be and the above vitriol, the Beatles would, under George Martin's Merlin-like guidance, reunite as a harmonious group, and the magic would return. They would consummate their legacy and gift to the world with their masterful swan song, Abbey Road, knowing beforehand that this album would be their last. They exited the stage like Yahweh exited from history. Disillusioned perhaps, but nonetheless victorious in spirit. That sentence refers to something discussed in the later part of the prologue. Yahweh goes through a transformation experience himself, which Jung put his finger on very adroitly in his book, Answer to Job. The Beatles exited the stage like Yahweh exited from history. Again, delusion perhaps, but nonetheless victorious in spirit. Their concluding message, also gentle and glorious, was that at the end of the day, the love we get is measured by the love we give. Ah, if only Yahweh had realized this, if only we would. Their joy and goodness account for their undying durability, so it seems, generation after generation. Judy, how are we doing on time, please?
It's almost 5:15.
I think we'll have to let Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio meet with you separately and privately, should you be interested in following that chapter up in the book. It also looks at a marriage from the point of view of both the man's complex and the woman's complex. Marilyn Monroe had a Aphrodite complex, goddess of love, eroticism, sensual life. And Joe DiMaggio was a chip off the shoulder of Yahweh. He was very jealous, controlling, paranoid, insecure, and cold, could be very cold. That chapter looks at what happens when in a couple, when the Yahweh complex encounters another god complex, because Aphrodite complex is also a god or goddess complex. What happens when the two of them get together? The marriage might be made in heaven, but it has to be lived on earth, and it doesn't always look good. Just like the Hebrew Bible with its many wars and the 70, I counted over 70 episodes of Holocaust, of genocide in the Hebrew Bible. That's a lot. Okay. I think we could take a 5-minute break and then reconvene and have questions and answers. And again, I welcome a brief portrait of your Yahweh complex episode if you have one and wish to share it. Okay, so it's 5:20. It's 5:15. Let's meet at 5:20.
Okay. See you all in 5 minutes.
I think that's okay. Judy,
I'm here.
um, is my background too dark?
No, you're good. You're fine.
Okay.
I think you can just go ahead.
Okay. Questions, answers, commentary?
Okay,
First-
so use the raise hand function. And then I will see you and I will send you an unmute request. If you want to make a comment. Paula St. Marie.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. It's very rich. And when you were talking about the Beatles, I was thinking about the Rolling Stones. And they've survived a long time together. And I'm thinking it's possible because they've integrated more of the shadow, maybe, than the Beatles persona, initial persona, which was very positive. And they just owned what they were and went with it, and they've lasted a long time now. They're still
Yes.
playing.
60 years.
Yeah. So which is amazing. So that occurred to me. And
Yeah.
also don't the
I have a honorarium to the Rolling Stones behind me,
oh, you do? I see that. Oh, no, I see it. Yeah,
the
cool.
poster.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also okay, go ahead. What was your other observation?
Well, no, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Oh, well, I think that's right. And I talk about that in the chapter. What is it that they did that assured their longevity? Well, they always got back together and worked out their shadow stuff with each other.
Mhm.
But it was also, the nature of what they were writing about was more directly concerned with the problem of evil than the Beatles. It was a choice in their lyrics and their interests in the way they were living. Contrary to what many people think, the song "Sympathy for the Devil" isn't an encouragement for people to be demonic or evil. It is much more the purpose to challenge it or address it in a responsible, ethical way. Now, they don't say that in their lyrics, but
Right.
When they talk about it off the record, literally off the record, they point to, particularly with all those historical episodes in that song that Mick Jagger is singing about. He has been known to be a avid reader, and his favorite subject is history. Keith Richards too. He's very interested in history. There's
Right.
a picture of him in his study with the wall to wall, nothing but books.
Really? Uh-huh.
Yeah. So the willingness to confront and explore the problem of evil makes us more balanced and complete.
Yeah, like even like if say you are this highly critical person, right? Well, the flip side of that could be like you're very good at detail, right? I mean, it's like an energy, and it's which way it's used and recognized in yourself too.
Yeah.
That's how I kind of see it.
Yeah. The Rolling Stones, in their orientation, were much more interested in the sensual life than the psychologically introspective life. They do share a lot of insights in their lyrics, but they're much more interested in the Dionysian god,
Right.
And the chapter talks about that. So the Dionysian god is another Greek other and opposite in temperament to Yahweh. So that the relationship to Yahweh is one of, as I say in the chapter, even an anti-relationship or a critical relationship is a relationship. They didn't really manifest the Yahweh complex differently than the Beatles. They had their issues too, that which you brought up when you started talking. They felt that they were much more oriented toward the Dionysian god complex. So
Pleasure.
the
Pleasure.
negative attitude toward Yahweh, and I have quotes from their songs that show how they were against, for example, their album Bridges to Babylon. It's not an exaltation, it's an exaltation of the senses.
Right. Yeah.
Babylon being in Christian history a place of associated with sin and lust and indulgence and so on. They knew that. I think the point I'm trying to make is simply that having a negative relationship is still a relationship. So they were bouncing Dionysus off of Yahweh, so to speak. And you get that even in their later albums, and in some ways more eloquently.
Mhm. Well, it could be everybody has a Yahoo complex. It's just how it comes out. I mean, like you have to find a way to work with it, or
Well, it does come out in all these different ways. What we do and what we think and what we feel and what we say that's hurtful to others or untruthful. And we have to work with it. We can't just make it disappear. Now, some people never have very rare among Westerners and Muslims. Some people never have a real contact with it, but most of us do, and we just don't know it's the Yahweh complex in the moment.
yeah,
That kind of anger and vitriol and judgmental features that we project onto people. Judgment is one of the sub-archetypes of the Bible. The day of judgment in all three Abrahamic religions is that God will judge us for our deeds.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very unique Western and Islamic notion.
Yeah. My husband keeps reminding me it's Yahweh, not Yahoo. I keep saying Yahoo instead of Yahweh.
Well,
that could be a slip there.
If you make it Yahweh your the identity for your email, it will be interesting what you'll generate.
Oh, I bet.
Would be
I
interesting.
think I'll pass on that. Yeah.
Any other?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, we don't have any other raised hands. Don't be shy. Okay, there's one. Oh, Margaret Mendenhall. Hello, Margaret.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. You
You made me think something that I never took into consideration before, or thought of this way, but I deal with a lot like very hyper self-critical. Could that be the way that this shows up in me?
Absolutely. Actually, the Marilyn Monroe chapter, she was in that regard, she had a real Yahvistic streak, which is why she was attracted to Yahvistic men, like the theater teacher of the method. She studied with him, and he was described, and it's in the book, as having a very Yahvistic character. And she needed a little bit of Yahvistic groundedness to deal with her self-loathing. So the self-criticism of the Yahweh complex is the same as the criticism of others. It's turned inward. The psychoanalyst Ronald Fairbairn calls it the internal saboteur or the internal critic. And you get a lot of that criticism and judgment in the Hebrew Bible coming out of Yahweh and being told to the Israelites to manifest it in the world, to be very moral in the world and very warlike at the same time. So when it's directed against us, it's the complex getting constellated out of the collective unconscious, beating up the ego. And a lot of things that people act out unconsciously, like these shooting sprees, like in these shooting sprees, when we become more self-conscious, actually, when the ego develops more, it then also can become more self-critical. A certain amount of self-criticism and judgment of who we are and how we live is important and can be very healthy or be very unhealthy if we don't have that toward ourselves. It means we don't look at our shadow. Something Robert Johnson, I believe he called it the white shadow. Somebody has a shadow that everybody else could see except the person who has it, because it's projected out. So what you're describing is its internal dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I've been battling for a really, really long time. And yeah, I never looked at it quite like it could be something like this.
Well, labeling it as an archetype or a complex helps us to deal with the shadow.
Yeah, it does.
We've objectified it and we're not further beating ourselves up for having it. It's archetypal. It's an instinct of the psyche. It's inherited as part of the collective unconscious in us. So it's not that I have it and nobody else does, which is a kind of negative inflation. I have it too. We all have it.
Yeah.
In the last chapter of the book, How to Live with the Yahweh Complex, I talk about active imagination, where the ego talks with the Yahweh complex, and talks with the shadow, and the back and forth, that active imagination is the basic method of Jung's Red Book. And that's what got so transformed in him, was he was getting all this insight with some criticism that deepened him and deepened his awareness of the nature of the archetypal psyche in him. That's not quite the same talking to the Yahweh in us as talking to the Yahweh outside of us. Because if we're talking and writing down a dialogue between us and the Yahweh complex outside of us, that can be done, but it's closer to prayer than it is to active imagination. Active imagination, you'd want to deal with the complex directly on its own terms. There's a saying among the soothsayers and shamans in different cultures that if you know the name of a demon, it doesn't make it automatically go away, but it gives you a way to deal with it by calling it out by its name, because you label it and then you know what it is. And it itself gets shocked into a kind of, Jung calls it quasi-consciousness. that could be very dynamic in terms of one's experience. It's a way of touching, like the Red Book, the depths of the psyche in different human forms. So that's something that one comes up inevitably against in their analysis. If they're bringing in dreams, then sooner or later a shadow-like figure, a fallen god of some kind manifests. Very often it's Yahweh, but the Yahweh within us.
Well, I actually even written a one woman show where Mime is perfect and Puella talk to each other. I don't think I went deep enough, or still I'm not getting it, but that seems like,
Yeah.
But thank you, because I don't want to take up any more time. I see others have hands going, so thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Joanne Lombardi.
Okay. Can you see me, hear me? Yep. Oh, okay. Thank you so much for this profound presentation. It was just, the energy moving through me I feel it's kind of a complex. I'm not sure quite what it is, but it's in the solar plexus. A couple of things. I wanted to start off with the importance of naming things. As you said, read you a little quote. If you can give something a name and a shape, you have power over it. But if you cannot give it a name and a shape, then it has power over you. And I think that's what I'm leading into with my question here is, I'm so trying to grasp and hold of what is going on in the world today with, I'll just name it, our former president and evangelicals or fundamentalists. And this talk today just really helped me in naming what is going on here and getting a deeper understanding. And so my question is to you, in taking this next level for understanding myself, is, does the Yahweh complex as a collective group exist? Would you say that's happening with evangelicals right now? That it's and their need to draw or bring into being as the chosen one that particular type of God complex, Yahweh complex?
Well, American and in general Western evangelists are all in service to a strongly constellated Yahweh complex. That's correct. The preoccupation with sin, the harsh criticism against it, the literal or legalistic taking a sentence out of the Bible and making it a law, or you should do it, and if you don't do it, you will burn in hell. Well, that's part of Yahweh's style in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and the Qur'an. The Qur'an is interesting in that regard because it's as bad as Yahweh in its moral rhetoric. But in fact, for all the terrible things that Allah says to Muhammad, who's writing down the revelation while it was happening, the revelation went on for something like 13 or 14 years. Contrary to the Hebrew Bible, where Yahweh doesn't only say that he's going to visit this village and punish its people because they're worshiping an idol, he actually does it. Whereas in Islam, he himself doesn't do such terrible things. You have to remember that Yahweh, even in the form of Allah, is a war god. So, and Muhammad was a warrior. He was contemplative, like many warriors can be, but he was trying to establish and build an empire. Well, that really brings out the Yahweh complex because it's in the history of our religious traditions that war and its other dark forms of violence they're abounding with that. Our traditions are abounding with that.
Which is as an example of, then again, it's what's saying what's happening in the East in the wars right now, Israel and Palestine. It's that warrior aspect, revenge kind of thing, that is Yahweh complex playing out with at least part of, like, say, the Israeli and army or military.
Well, that's a complex, sticky phenomenon. It's hard to talk about it briefly. It really requires a full 2 hours of its own.
Imagine.
But that the two sides, each having a close connection to the warrior side of Yahweh or Allah, that's a fact. And that plays a role on both their parts.
In justification.
Now, there are wars that are necessary wars. I think America getting into the theater of World War II when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor, I think that was a necessary, as many historians do, a necessary development that doesn't make war holy, but has a holy aspect in that it's more evil and dangerous and destructive to not do something. So there are wars that are necessary. Most of them, history shows, could have been diverted and dealt with differently, but we haven't caught up with the wisdom of our own history yet.
Exactly.
You know, in alchemy, suffering, emotional suffering, and overwhelming depression and rage, all these things. Alchemy teaches that that kind of suffering is when we fail to extract the wisdom of suffering. You know, there's a lot of that wisdom in the three religions too. So we have to kind of remain balanced in our understanding of how these internal forces shape history and shape us, shape our characters.
Yeah. Thank you for, I know we can go on with the war. One last thing I wanted to say is about the Bible. And
We do have other people waiting.
Okay, I won't get into that. It's just,
yeah, because the time is running, but if there's time at the end, we can come back to you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
I just discovered somebody wrote me in the chat. So apparently there's the wrong link, and I'm really sorry for ordering Michael's book. It links to the previous book that you wrote, Michael. So I have to figure out how that happened, and I'll figure it out, and I'll send the correct link to everybody once we get that straightened out.
Yeah, we've had a turnover of staff at the Los Angeles Young Institute, so sometimes things end up in the wrong mailbox. So
right, or it could be my mistake. I'll have to try to figure it out. But we'll email everybody who attended and with the correct link. And now we're going to go on to Lynn Harta. Whoops, I guess, did I unmute you? Thought I had.
There we go.
Okay,
Thank you very much. I appreciate it indeed, this really helpful and deep awareness. And my thoughts have to do with, I will describe David in the Old Testament as a quality of the capacity to deal between warrior and one who has a tone and a a music, I will say, which is what I would hear in what you've been describing as those who form the music that we also appreciated and learn from. But what I wanted to know is David's spirit and how his voice is interpreted, because I really understand that in so much of the back and forthing that is in daily life, there's a capacity, especially with, I'm married for 62 years, and the capacity to be able to hold on to a tone that is not judgmental is so hard to do. Can you talk about that?
Well, if we're working on the inner dimension of good and evil, we don't have to talk so much about it. We have to talk about it when we're not learning from our suffering and the suffering we cause others. David was reputed in post-biblical literature, was God's favorite. Moses and David, people argue, the theologians argue, who did God love more, Moses or David? David was a very flawed character. He arranged to have his chief general killed in battle so that he could marry his wife, whom he had impregnated while the general was at war. And one of the prophets, I forget which one, came to his court and started describing a man who has that behavior. And David got up and said that such a man should not be allowed to live. And then the prophet said, well, that man is you. And David was shocked. And God punished him severely, took his favorite child away to death. And that episode went on. It's dealt with briefly in the Hebrew Bible, but it went on for quite a while, for years. He was very depressed and was forced to, as Jungians would say, eat the shadow, to really digest it. So knowing about these complexes and how they affect us, you could argue that David didn't need a Yahweh complex in order to kill this general. He had the example of Yahweh before him, because David comes along with the book of Psalms. It's already later in the Hebrew Bible. And he was working on it within himself. Now, Yahweh himself has a positive side and a side that was preoccupied with the laws of morality, but not for himself, for his creations, his people. So Yahweh himself acts as if he's amoral. You know, the saying that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Well, with Yahweh, the right hand and the left hand knew what the other was doing and didn't care.
I think there's something about wisdom in this, isn't there?
Well, if we extract the wisdom that we all have both a good side and a dark side, and that we use the good side to help us fathom and understand the dark side without becoming merged with it.
Yeah.
That is why Jung argued that in the book of Job, the human being was redeemed and not, and the God was redeemed. That it was not only, the Hebrew Bible is, especially the book of Job, is not only about our redemption, but God's redemption.
Yeah.
Because he needed humanity to reflect to him how bad it is to suffer. Because a mega personality, a super being like Yahweh, doesn't know suffering firsthand. He's a God. So we have to work with the divine side of ourselves and tame the dark side that is also divine in a way, because we didn't invent the shadow. We fell into it, as the book of Genesis with Adam and Eve portrays it. Why did God put a tree in the garden that would cause a sin if he didn't plan on humanity eating it?
Right.
So that's a little kind of tricky logic that the that biblical scholars look at to better understand what happens when we live in the world. That there, as the Bible says, there is not one man, it's in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's not one man on the planet who is morally perfect.
No.
And
But
accepting
most
that,
of
rather than, evangelists preach what they themselves cannot practice, as if it could be completely realized that one is transcended evil. Life does not support that. And that's when they get into trouble.
I'm thinking about still that voice, and I really am much astonished that that quality of the voice that is able to express is really part of what we, as those who move into what is beyond the capacity that we've had already, and we're moving into what's future, we have to have that voice that has no judgment in it, but it has music in it.
From your mouth to God's ear.
Mhm.
Although I don't think the task is to diminish or repress evil, but rather to understand it at a safe and healthy distance,
Mhm.
to live with full view of it in the world and even within us. The music that David supposedly composed, that consists of the book of Psalms, a lot of that was his grief around killing his general.
Mhm.
And that side of him never left him. He just learned a whole different new level of how to live with it.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
I won't say too much about it, but I have a section in the Holy Wars chapter on Putin, which I wrote that years ago when I was writing the book. In the years that I was writing the book, I had a couple of paragraphs on Putin and what he's been doing to this day is not a surprise when you know those things that make up his constitution. He had has a very powerful Yahweh complex, and at heart, he's on a religious mission, which the West has not paid much attention to.
No, I agree. Yeah. Thank
People
you.
with religious missions are, as Ernest Hemingway said, the most dangerous, because they believe that they're innocent and that they have a mandate to do even a genocide to get their visionary views in the world, to build their mission into a reality. They're willing to kill and do whatever they have to do. it's a fanatical identification with the dark side of Yahweh.
It is. That's right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Good question.
We have one more hand raised, although sometimes some pop up at the last minute, but John Davis.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I know the subject matter and the energy is passed already from the subject of the Rolling Stones. But if you don't mind, I'd like to circle back to that just for a moment and make a quick comment. I'm coming to you from the Austin, Texas area now, where I've lived for the last 40 years plus. But once upon a time, I was a young man, and I lived in San Francisco in 1969, 70, and 71, around that time. And I lived there during the time of the infamous Altamont concert, if any of you remember that. And I actually went to that and was at that Altamont concert. And just to refresh, if people don't know about that, that was the concert that was a free concert just outside of San Francisco, where the Rolling Stones, the Jefferson Airplane, and some others played. And I was working during that day. The concert started in the afternoon. I was working during the day. And then when I got off work, one of the ladies that I knew and I drove out there to the concert. It was at, the Altamont was a sort of a stock car racing track. And that's where they held this. And so we drove there. Gosh, if I remember, it was maybe 20 miles outside of San Francisco, something like that. So, as I said, it had already started an hour or two before we got there. And I'm imagining that the parking must have been something like at Woodstock. I didn't go to Woodstock, but I mean, cars were parked on both sides of the road for miles before you ever even got to the actual speedway where the concert was. So since we were kind of late, we ended up parking like about 2 miles down the road and had to walk to the concert. And we got there late. The crowd was already huge because it was a free concert, Rolling Stones. So we saw some of the Jefferson Airplane concert. And in hindsight, somebody, the road managers or somebody, had hired the Hells Angels to be the security for this concert. So in hindsight, we can say, what the hell were they thinking, hiring the Hells Angels to be security for this concert?
I answer your question in the chapter on the Rolling Stones.
So anyway, they had the Jefferson Airplane had trouble with the Hells Angels. They were at odds, and one of the Hells Angels even punched one of the Jefferson Airplane band members. So anyway, the Rolling Stones come on, and Rick Jagger is kind of in this outfit that he gets in when they played that song, Sympathy for the Devil. And they got into that song. My memory is maybe a little bit fuzzy now, so I don't remember if they were playing that song when this happened. But as we know, as some of you may know, what happened is while the Stones were playing.
Let me come in because we only have a couple of minutes left. Did you have a particular question about that, or what you wanted us to contemplate as a particular?
Yes, I wanted to tell you about the respect that I gained for Mick Jagger at that time. Before that, just Mick Jagger, the leader of the Rolling Stones. But what happened is that a ruckus broke out in the crowd, and some of the Hells Angels or somebody attacked a couple of the people with pool cues or with something, and it ended up killing one of the spectators. Yeah. Which we didn't know that he was being killed at that moment. It was only after the fact that we realized he was dead. But during that whole thing, the Stones were playing, and Mick Jagger was singing the song. And of course, everything stopped while all of this was going on. It was a pretty big scene out in this huge crowd. And Mick Jagger said, "Brothers and sisters, why are we fighting? Why are we fighting, brothers and sisters? We're here to celebrate."
Yeah.
Something to that effect. But that really stuck with me, is that he was actually trying to calm things down. Some people could say, well, they were responsible for stirring things up. That depends on your point of view, I guess. But I gained a lot of respect for Mick Jagger at that time, because he did what he could to calm things down at the time.
Well, they didn't realize what they were getting into, and Keith Richards also was very forthright in trying to calm the ruckus down. It came after they had sung "Sympathy for the Devil," and Mick Jagger reflected in that moment. He said to the audience, "Something very strange happens every time we play that song," because people think it's a encouragement to be devilish or demonic, whereas that's not what the song is trying to do. It's trying to make us aware of the devilish and demonic nature of human history. But it does raise certain questions, and when one is innocent in the sense of not aware of the dark side of nature, often something happens to make us aware of it, and that's part of individuation. So he handled it well, and the band later in the film, the documentary that they did on the creation of that song, they talked about how in that very point, that if you're innocent, you can be taken and hoodwinked, that the devil doesn't come looking like the medieval images of him. He comes knocking on your door dressed in a tuxedo with a bouquet of flowers, and that then leads to something darker happening because of our innocence, our ignorance. So that whole episode is psychologically interesting and complicated, and if you're interested, I encourage you to read it. I try to put it in context of the Yahweh complex as well. Other questions or comments?
I think that's it.
Okay.
There definitely, that link is a mistake. I think it was my mistake, but maybe it's a good thing, because from your lecture, people are going to want to read your book now. So I will send them an email like tonight or tomorrow morning with the link to the correct place, and then everybody can order your book.
Okay. Thank you.
So I guess with that, thank you so much, Michael. This was, as somebody said, a really, really rich, very, very rich.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you all at the March lecture. And actually, I'm thinking that this talk is going to be a nice segue into our Nianol's talk in June on the nature of evil. So that's an interesting connection that we accidentally maybe set up. So thank you again so much, Michael. Really, really, really rich talk. And bye, everyone. See you next month.